This is one of the most beautiful passages in the Bible, one of the best known, one that we all see and we think we understand, and we do for the most part. But it's such a contrast to what we see elsewhere. I'm going to go through some of that this morning. But as a warning to you as we get into this, I want you to know that this is really just an introduction. I don't mean by that we're going to spend 20 or 30 minutes on an introduction and then spend another 10 hours going through the beatitudes today. I know that disappoints some of you, but we're going to take some time and do this off and on over this year. And as we do so this morning, I want you to notice something. The word blessed. Brother Mike Swanson a couple of years ago gave us a little bit of a lesson on this and said, notice this doesn't say blessed, it says blessed. Well, it says blessed, doesn't it? But actually, as Randy read it, you heard blessed, and that's the way it's supposed to be pronounced. If you say blessed, I'm not going to jump out of a window over it. I can't fit through those anyway. But blessed, what does blessed mean? It means happy, doesn't it? How many of you in here are familiar with Duck Dynasty? Duck Dynasty, Phil, the old man, happy, happy, happy. That's what we're talking about here, isn't it? We are happy if we are these things. That doesn't sound right, though, does it? It sounds like there's something wrong if we go up here and say, well, happy are you if you're poor? Or even as it says here in the new Matthew, the poor in spirit. By the way, Luke chapter 6 carries this as well. When we go back through and go through these one lesson at a time, we'll spend a lot more time doing that. But the idea of happiness is contrary to what has been done before. We're going to go through that in a moment, though. Know that Jesus did something different. I'll give you a teaser. When God gave the law of Moses, and he took Moses up on the mountain, chiseled out the law of the rules on stone, what were the first 10? Thou shalt not. Couldn't Jesus have done the same thing? Thou shalt not be poor, or thou shalt not be unhappy if you're poor. Whatever he might have said. That's not what he does, though, is it? He actually says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now that's 8, right? You'll notice in my title I said 8 parentheses 9. Well, I did that for a reason, but the main reason is because if you look at the arguments that are made, most everybody talks about there being either 6, 10, maybe a couple of these are just repeating the same thing over again. And this one in particular, the 9th one, is where he goes on there in verse 11 and says, blessed are you if you're reviled and if you're persecuted for my name. And it could be the same thing. It could be the same thing as when he said at the end there. But we'll talk about that more as we go on. But I want to talk about the context for a minute here. Everybody knows what context means, right? We learned that in school. Context is where it sits, where it resides. It doesn't reside in a vacuum. This doesn't just all of a sudden show up as a nice little neat little plaque, and it doesn't have any history, doesn't have any words around it, doesn't have any words before it or after it. No, it actually has a history. It actually has a context. Let's take a look at the context of this for a moment, if I can figure out. Okay. First of all, this is over 2,000 years after Abraham. Does anybody know exactly when Abraham lived? If you do, would you let me know? Appreciate it. I've heard numbers anywhere from 1800 BC to 2400 BC, even as much as 3000 BC. I don't think it's quite that long before, but maybe. But it's a good 4,000 years ago or more. And the context of the Sermon on the Mount is over 2,000 years after Abraham. Now, why is that significant? Well, Abraham was the father of the Israelite nation, wasn't he? Particularly, he was the father of the Hebrew people. He was the one that God went to because he was righteous and says, pick up your things and move. I'm going to take you to a place and give you a land that you do not deserve, but you and your descendants will receive it as a gift from me. Abraham, by faith, packed up and went. I've said this before, that I thought maybe Sarah's faith was a little bit greater than Abraham's even, because her husband walks in and says, God talked to me today, and she accepted that. How many of you wives would do that if your husband came in and said that to you today? Huh? I don't see any hands. Yeah, that's kind of what I figured Sarah was too. She was willing, though, to accept that that's what God had told him to do. Over 1,500 years after Moses, maybe not. We know that the arguments concerning the dating of this go anywhere from about 1250 AD to about BC to about 1550 BC. We don't know the exact time, but let's presume the early one, 1,500 years. Moses gave the law of Moses to the Hebrew people as a covenant between God and the Israelite nation. He starts off with thou shalt not, and then gives 600 and however many it is, laws that they had to keep in order to be faithful to God in that covenant relationship. And here Jesus is going to give them something different. We also have King David. How many of you know King David? Personally? Okay, just checking. David ruled about 1,000 years before Christ was born. So this is over 1,000 years later when Jesus gives us the Sermon on the Mount, which includes the Beatitudes here. Is that significant? Well, David is in the lineage of Jesus, isn't he? David ruled as the king in Israel, and in fact, God says he was a man after my own heart. He ruled righteously in Israel. Was he perfect? No, he wasn't perfect. In fact, the Bible tells us some of his sins. You know, I'm so thankful the Bible did not put Haskell Hallmark in the Bible. I just think it'd be so embarrassing to have everybody know my sins. David was righteous, but he was still a human, wasn't he? But David wasn't the only one that we're talking about here. How about Isaiah? Prophesied concerning the coming of the Messiah. They expected the Messiah to come, and they had an expectation that was different than what God had actually told them to expect. But they nevertheless had this vision of what he should be. And as a result of that, 700 years later, when Jesus came, they rejected him and says, no, you can't be the Messiah. But he was. And he gives this message. Not just 700 years after Isaiah, but 500 years after Jeremiah. Maybe more like 600 years actually after Jeremiah. Pardon me for putting 500 there. I did say over though, didn't I? Jeremiah prophesied to Jerusalem. Called them to repentance in the name of the Lord, or they would be destroyed. They did not. 500, 600 years later, Jesus comes to Jerusalem. That's the main context. How about this? There were four major groups of the Jews at this time: Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots. Some would put Essenes in there perhaps. We know that the Bible actually refers to the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. But the Zealots, but the Essenes are not referred to very much. We know them primarily because of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, don't we? But apparently they were a significant influence, at least in a portion of the people during that time. The Pharisees, again, this is context. The Pharisees demanded strict observance of the Mosaic Law, as recorded in the Torah, but also accepted the oral tradition of the Jewish customs and rituals. Do we hear Jesus condemning that every once in a while? Yes, we do, don't we? We read in Matthew 23, for example. We'll go to that later. The Pharisees were very strict observers of the law. Sadducees, which mainly came from the priestly families, also strictly accepted the laws of Moses, but they rejected the oral traditions and customs. Perhaps we would have thought more about them if we'd have realized that's what they were doing so much of. But they are the leaders, so we see them as the bad guys because they're trying to kill Jesus, aren't they? Was it just the Sadducees trying to kill Jesus? No, it was the Pharisees and the Sadducees, wasn't it? How about the Zealots? Well, we know that at least one of the disciples was a Zealot. We understand the Zealots were, as a people, a militant group of Jews who thought that they needed to somehow stir the Israelites up to reject the Roman captivity or the Roman oppressors, because that's the way they felt they should be. They should be free. They wanted their freedom from Roman rule, particularly over their homeland. The Essenes weren't much different in that regard, except they were an apocalyptic monastery, a monastic group that kind of isolated themselves from society. And in doing so, they expected the Messiah to come. They expected it to be an apocalyptic coming with great fire and brimstone and warfare. great loss all the way around. But they expected it so they could free the Israelites from the oppression of the Romans at that time. That's the four major groups. And you see a theme running through here. Keep the law of Moses perfectly and expect freedom from God, particularly the Messiah as he comes. So I mentioned just a little bit ago that the law of Moses begins with 10 thou shalt nots. That's fairly negative, isn't it? Presuming that we're going to commit murder, lie, false witness, steal, commit adultery. Thou shalt not do those things. If you understand the idolatry of those round about them, you'd understand that that was a way of life among the idolaters, and it would be expected that he would start with the thou shalt nots. But it is a negative law. And in fact, we're told in the New Testament that the law of Moses could not save. And one of the reasons it couldn't save is because it didn't deal with the issue of sin in the first place. What it did instead was to teach us how sinful sin really is. That's an amazing statement in Romans chapter 2 and Galatians, where he goes through and shows that the law of Moses taught us about sin. Well, Jesus is not teaching us about sin, is he? He instead brought a message of humility, charity, and brotherly love. By the way, charity is an old English word for love, right? The Beatitudes are not written negatively. They are written instead positively. How about blessed are you or happiness to you? Man, that's quite a contrast with the law of Moses, isn't it? That's what these are there for there. How about beatitude with misery? By the way, the word beatitude comes from a Latin word out of the Latin Vulgate, which is a reference to these happiness or blessings that are listed here. And so it actually comes from the Latin, the beatitude. Doesn't mean anything, in other words. How about happiness versus misery? Do you understand that? I think we do, don't we? Well, blessed are the poor. Blessed are the poor in spirit. How is it that we can be blessed if we're poor? Aren't the poor in abject poverty? Aren't they actually in misery? It's one of those things that earthly views will say things like that. And in fact, in the culture of that particular community, they believed that an individual who was poor was cursed by God. It was his place, either because of his weakness or his failing or his spiritual inadequacy, that he would be poor. And thus, those who were rich were what? Blessed by God, weren't they? Did Jesus give us that kind of a message, though? Blessed are you if you're rich. Because God obviously finds favor with you. Right? Is that what he says? That's not what he says, is it? He says instead, the rich are going to have a very difficult time making it to heaven. But he tells the poor, yours is the kingdom of heaven. These are the kind of messages that we have that is very different in this particular message than any other thing that we have. How about the kingdom? The kingdom is spoken of in both the present tense and in the future tense. There are those who would argue that this is merely a statement concerning God's blessings once you finally die and go to heaven. Well, we can accept that if that's what it is. But it seems like the kingdom is present even at that moment. What is John preaching, John the Baptist preaching when he comes? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Jesus then came. There was a kingdom of heaven that existed at that moment. Now, we always go to the kingdom of heaven and go to Acts chapter 2 and the day of Pentecost, where he established with power what he had said he was going to do, Mark chapter 9 and others. And we say that's where it began. The church was established at that point. That is his kingdom now. And I believe that's very much true. But we need to understand that the kingdom was not just at that point in the future. By the way, let's make sure we recognize, too, that Jesus is not just talking with the spiritual leaders. In fact, it appears the spiritual leaders may not have even been here at this point. This is early in his ministry, apparently. There are two recordings of it in various forms, slightly different form, Luke chapter 6 as well as Matthew chapter 5. And it appears that the Jewish leaders and leadership came in a little bit later. So he's talking to his disciples and to the common people. Notice there in verses 1 and 2, he says he saw the multitudes